Hey everyone, this is Frodan with my best of Leona Houston regional qualifier deck that I won the medal card with earlier this month. This video's coming out a little bit later than I wanted to because I had to go to the Paris Open for TFT right afterwards and compete there. And then I came back and I had to stream to kind of catch up on my hours. Then I had my family come in for holiday Christmas, but I figured better late than never. And I want to show the world why Leona is really fun and ultimately how I did it when I won the medal card. In this video, I'm going to cover all the basics of the deck, of how Leona operated and what you're thinking about with each card and trying to talk about its role. I'm going to also give some card suggestions on things to think about and what the version of the deck I would bring if I were to do it again, because I definitely learned a lot of lessons both while I was playing it and after some reflection. And then we're going to go over matchups for a bit and talk about what to expect and some of the key cards to think about. Because with Leona, the reality is there are just some better legends to play around and better decks. And the matchup guide is going to be very often, okay, these are the cards you have to be thinking about and playing around. But the reality is it's kind of a bad matchup. So hopefully you can execute your game plan. Speaking of game plan, let's break down what exactly this Leona deck wants to do and what are some of the powerful things about it. The general game plan of Leona for this was to be aggressive. I actually felt like categorizing this as like a mid-range hold deck is incorrect. I actually think this is an aggressive deck that tries to match the pace of the field. I knew that Kaisa and Annie were going to be pretty popular, and I thought that they're going to be pretty well represented, so I biased my deck to be able to try and keep up with them. And I wanted to try to match them point for point and hopefully get one or two turns where I could deny them their big swings. And you're talking about, Darius Treferian with Cleave and trying to get those big swing turns to push your units off the field. If I can deny them with one card, whether it's a Rune Prison, a Face Breaker, things of that sort, that end up having really big rune and tempo swings in my favor. The second thing was make combat really complicated for them. Leona's passive, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is really good for stunning. And the threat of stunning is sometimes what makes it even better than the stun itself. And so when you're getting onto the battlefield and you have, good shield units and make it difficult for people to attack into, when you threaten to stun them, it actually complicates combat math a lot. And because Leona's passive actually gives the buff, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So my goal was to make a consistent curve, be aggressive, get onto the battlefield, and use stuns to make it difficult for your opponents to get back onto the battlefield. Because in case you don't know, I guess I should have explained what stun does, but stun says you can't deal combat damage this turn, which means that even if they have a 100 might unit coming into the battlefield attacking your little tiny Poro, if they stun it, they bounce off, and that's it for their movement that turn. So finding a way to get to the point, hold it, and push your opponent off is really, really key. And that's why I would categorize this as being a little bit more of an aggressive deck that tries to curve out and play very tempo oriented. And you'll find that this deck is actually really fun because you get a lot of really unique play patterns with how your opening hands are. And we're actually going to talk about mulligans as well. And the last reason to play around Leona that I think is also really underrated is that I think the deck is pretty cheap. For the most part, it's under $100, and you can probably play budget options as well. The only thing that I think you really can't replace is Zenith Blade, but you could definitely cut down the number of Leonas or sets or Fioras and justify them in other ways. And overall, I think the deck is quite affordable. So that's another reason why I think Leona is very solid. I think it's important to start off with what is this deck trying to do? And I think that the win condition for this deck is to basically play a tempo / aggressive version of Leona and utilize stuns to stop your opponent's power turns. The winning plays a lot of times that I got from Leona was to get a lot of nullification. Basically, by stunning their champion, they can't take points back for the big swing turns, and they invest a lot of mana or resources into big plays, and you try to look for the advantages to break their serve or to basically deny them a huge power swing. Starting off with the legend Leona Radiant Dawn, when you stun one or more enemy units, buff a friendly unit. This passive is awesome because it can trigger multiple times per turn, unlike other legends that may require you to, exhaust it and you only use it one time. Kaisa, Darius, Yasuo, so on and so forth. You can get multiple buffs in a turn, and it also works well on enemy turns as well, making it very complicated for some combat math and some big tricks, right? That's where a lot of these small combat tricks that you get in the deck actually get a little bit more value, because if you can combo with stun in some ways, it really surprises some people. They mess up their turns. And we talked about how a lot of times with Leona, the number one thing you think about is disruption on the enemy turn, figuring out a way to make them lose a lot of value when they invest a lot into a power swing. The rune splits are going to be even because, well, I mean, I don't really see a reason to lean one way over the other right now, especially because Zenith Blade is both green and yellow. So just use whatever you have excess of. So yellow green split makes sense here. Battlefields, I'm going to talk about a little bit right now, but we're going to revisit it once we talk about the entirety of the deck so that you understand a little bit more. But the game number one, I'm going to lead off with Monastery of Hirana pretty much every single time because it is the best synergy with buffs and also doesn't help your opponents very much. I think this has been covered a lot if you've watched set decks or even watched Jeff Jones' Leona deck. It's just, a lot of decks don't really benefit from this, but ours do. So it ends up being really nice to draw cards. And drawing cards is actually one of the big weaknesses of Leona, which, probably should have talked about a little bit more. The weaknesses of Leona is, well, it's pretty apparent. It's bad into Kaisa. It struggles with card draw, and it can struggle to climb back into the game off of a big board wipe. So not exactly good from behind, but that's, a lot of decks actually currently in Riftbound. And so the Monastery Hirana helps you navigate through one of those weaknesses. And honestly, it's nice too when you go up against other matchups like set that play this battlefield because they help you a lot as well. Games number 2 and 3 just depend on whether or not I won game 1. If I won game 1 and I'm going to go second on game 2, I'm going to look for Windswap Hillock. Because I do think that this ganking ends up being really powerful. The mobility of Leona Determined and the cards like it is really key. And so having that ganking can be really, really clutch for your units that can go through battlefields. Grove of the Guidewill is purely for when I know I can go first and utilize that going first opportunity to get card draw because cards are good. Leona Determined is my chosen champion, and I think that this was my turn 2 play on 4 runes pretty much in 80 to 90% of my games. The only times I wouldn't play Leona Determined on turn 2 was when I felt like I had an actual better play to navigate around other things like Falling Star, if I felt like I had a hard read on it for whatever reason. I did that in a couple games against Kaisa where I played, say, for example, the Fiora instead because it didn't recycle a rune. And then based on the setup that I had with my cards, I played Leona Determined third and then pushed in. But for the most part, I would say in 89% of your matchups, you're going to play Leona Determined on turn 2 and try to push in with ideally one of the 2 mana cards that you played on turn 1. So that way you can get the stun from it. And then the other key element of Leona Determined is finding a time to pull her back because she does have shield when she's a defender. And so if you attack, buff her to 5, and then have shield, she can have up to 6 might, which is really problematic for a lot of decks to deal with, especially that early on. But the real value of Leona is when you put her back to base and your opponents are really scared to take another battlefield and conquer it because they just know that Leona's going to move in and stun it, especially with other follow-up combat tricks and threats. Most of the time when you attack at the very beginning of the game, Leona's going to buff herself, but don't be afraid to buff some of these other 2 drops because that just makes it really hard for your opponents to deal with. I'm looking at Poro, for example. If you attack and you buff the Poro and find a way to keep Leona safe, then Poro is going to be defending up to 4, and that just makes it difficult for the follow-up turns if your opponents are going to be playing things like, Kaisa Accelerated or other units that want to attack into the battlefield. And then that combined with stuns / combat tricks is pretty problematic. So I'm yapping a lot, but the TLDR is Leona is best when she can attack from base, and in general, she is more threatening when she isn't on a battlefield, unless you have the Hillock for the ganking, so you can attack from battlefield to battlefield because of the imminent threat that it puts on other opponents. Defy is one of the reasons to play green. The counterspell is really powerful against a wide variety of decks. Make sure that you understand what the deck's win conditions are. For example, this is really powerful. It's just one of the many layers that gives Annie a big problem because you can stop their Ride the Wind with Defy. You can stop their fight or flights. You can stop a bunch of their cheap combat tricks. That's not Rebuke because Rebuke is 2 rune cycles. It doesn't stop Falling Star for that same reasons, but it can deny a couple of other things like the Hextech Ray and the Void Seekers that they're looking for. Just a really versatile card. The 1 power recycling is actually okay. In fact, just talking about why I think this deck worked as well is because there were a lot of recycle costs, but I'm playing low curve, so it didn't actually really matter very much that I was recycling. That's part of why I felt like the deck was operating smoother is because I'm not playing these 7-8 drops that some people were including in their decks. And so recycling 1 for Defy didn't feel nearly as punishing even in the early game because let's say I play Leona on turn 2, recycle 1 down to 3. Next turn I have 5. That gives me an opportunity to drop another 4 plus hold 1 mana for Defy, and then I'm still kind of keeping my tempo curve up and pressuring my opponent. This is, of course, assuming you're going first. If you're going second, there's also some different mana breakpoints to consider. On guard is just efficient. In general, 1 mana for 2 might combat power is pretty decent of an exchange, and on guard is just really important to navigate through some of these tricky finesse turns where you have to float 1 or 2 mana. In general, with Leona, floating a bunch of mana is actually really problematic for your opponent to think about, because if you actually end up floating 4, even 5 mana, that's just so much range of possibilities, and On Guard is just one of those combat tricks that can really squeeze in. And then Leona is one of the decks that actually can do that, because Zenith Blade costs 3, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But On Guard in general is just really efficient for 1 mana. If you played green decks, you pretty much know how this works. Definitely include a lot of it. Stalwart Poro is the ideal turn 1 to play in the deck, mainly because a Poro is really good to leave at the battlefield once you attack with Leona. I like it a lot better than the other Poro, the Daring Poro, which I believe is the assault version of it, and you get +1 on it. And that's because I was using stuns and combat tricks to hold onto the point with cheap units, very similar to what Ari does, for example, with the Stalwart Poro. When they attack into you, it just becomes a little bit more complicated. So I felt like this Stalwart Poro was better than Daring Poro. Daring Poro also is more of a meta read call. The reason why you would play Daring Poro is to specifically attack into specific units and matchups, because the breakpoint of +1 might make the difference. But for now, I think Stalwart Poro is more versatile. Discipline is on guard with an additional card draw, which is very valuable. The card draw in this deck, as you might know, is not very high, so we actually need those card draws. Rune Prison. This card is actually the secret MVP of the deck, because in a vacuum, this card is not that high value, but there's actually secret text with it, which is stun a unit and buff a unit. And that ends up being really valuable for Rune Prison for the combat maths, and also activating other things like your Fiora, or if you're going to use things like Call to Glory. So Rune Prison is one of the real reasons why this deck can actually operate pretty smoothly. The timing of Rune Prison is really important. Because it's an action, you want to do it before they start doing all their other actions and reactions. And so just commit to it early and push people off. But a lot of people, they're going to commit to a Thousand-Tailed Watcher. You Rune Prison that Watcher, it does no damage, and they try to use the Watcher to get back into the game. It doesn't work. Same thing with things like the Deadwood Predator, right? They're kind of trying to play it to a battlefield. You stun it, you pay the deflect cost, and that's okay because, you have the recycling rune. It's going to be expensive, but it defends the battlefield. And perhaps most importantly, it really threatens for you to stay ahead, because if you have a bunch of additional stun targets, they're not able to get back onto the battlefield pretty easily. So Rune Prison ended up being a huge swing on things. I'm thinking about Darius plus Cleave turns, Thousand-Tailed Watchers. This is the card that single-handedly nullifies Ride the Wind plus Vi and Annie, and why I think the matchup is favored for you. But the important thing to remember about Rune Prison is that it is a late-game oriented card. You're not trying to use this early too often, because the range of what your opponent can put you on is really important. If they know that you use the Rune Prison and you're less likely to have one, that really decreases your defensive options with this card. So I try not to actually keep this in my mulligan unless I know for a fact I need it for a specific matchup, because this is a lot of times your checkmate card against a lot of other threats. Facebreaker is a fantastic card when you're ahead, and that's kind of the whole point of this deck, to be a little bit more aggressive. The Facebreaker is a way for you to maintain your presence on the battlefield and stop the big threats. Again, people are going to be swinging in with Watchers and Darius and other things like that, and that's a way for you to stall out. It's also a cheap card because you just recycle 1 rune, which again is not a big deal for our deck because we are such a low curve. And it's also an action card that can be played from hand. So if you don't have the situation where you want to hide a card, maybe you already hit a card with Zonia's, for example, then you can just play Facebreaker from hand. Another thing about Facebreaker is that it also activates Leona's passive, right? So you get Facebreaker, and if you have 2 things defending, sometimes it is correct to try to play for an all-in hold on 1 battlefield. You play Facebreaker, and then you stun a unit that doesn't matter, like a Clockwork Keeper, and then you buff another unit like Fiora or Set. And then all of a sudden you have a huge might swing, and it ends up just being like not only Rune Prison, but also an on guard / discipline. and ends up being very problematic for your opponent to deal with. Clockwork Keeper is another 2-drop because we want to be on curve, and it ends up giving us a card draw, and sometimes it ends up being the exact card you need. I definitely have played Clockwork Keepers to draw pretty early in the game if my hand is bad. So don't be afraid of using Clockwork Keeper to draw, but I wouldn't do it on turn 1 just because of how important the runes are. But I'm talking about like, turn 2 in Houston and end up paying off huge dividends. But that's in the situations where I felt like my battlefield, I was playing Windswap Hillock, for example. I don't have a card draw source, and I just sensed that my hand was going to need a lot more gas in order to get there. So it just kind of depends on the situation, but this card draw can be pretty clutch. Zonia's Hourglass is the way that you can keep Leona alive. The other ideal turn 1 play besides Stalwart Poro is Zonia's Hourglass, so that way you can play Leona on turn 2 and feel like you're going to have an opportunity to get multiple value from her. Not to mention that Zonia's Hourglass recalls that unit exhausted to the base, which is good for you because Leona gets to actually attack into a battlefield again and then stun an enemy. So Zonia's Hourglass is a really good synergy with Leona, and the difficulty is trying to justify 3 of these. So if you think about Zonia's Hourglass as a quote 2-drop, then you have Stalwart Poro and Keeper. Then you have 8 in total, which is pretty much about the standard that you want. 9 is a little bit aggressive, and also Zonia's Hourglass gets a little bit messier when you start going deep into the game and you have things like Shield Bearer and Sunlit Guardian. You just don't want Zonia's Hourglass to ever activate on some of these other things like Clockwork Keeper. It feels terrible. So 2 felt like the right sweet spot for me because I wanted to have it early, because late game it wasn't having as much impact. Zenith Blade is the reason to play the deck. It is the best card in Leona by far, and the reason why I even chose to play it, because it was really cool and fun to play. The stuff that you get to pull off with Zenith Blade is pretty outrageous, because imagine Showstopper from set, but you get to play at action speed. Like, a lot of people think this card is insane. Buff a friendly unit base and move it to a battlefield and you get that extra buff. But imagine you get the buff and stun, and you get to play it on your opponent's turns. And so you get to do some really crazy things with Zenith Blade that can swing pretty dramatically. In fact, it's got one of those rare scenarios where you can actually win from 5 points, because Zenith Blade can have you take over a battlefield and then you double score on the following swing and you go from 5. You can score on your opponent's turn 6 and then 7, 8. So Zenith Blade has a lot of flexibility. Not to mention that it's also extremely difficult for your opponent to deal with range. If you leave up 5 mana, is it because you have things like, double discipline with a defy, or is it because you have Zenith Blade and then, Rune Prison for double stun for their double swing, right? They can swing with Darius and Watcher, or they can swing with their big bodies, but you Zenith Blade Rune Prison, defend them off the point, and then also buff your units times 2 with 2 buffs on Rune Prison Zenith Blade. And those are just massive combat swings. So Zenith Blade is extremely fun. And the number one reason why I wanted to play Leona, because, well, I just really wanted to have fun with the deck. And that was the reason ultimately I decided to play Leona. It's just I tried a bunch of decks, and what was the deck I was having the most fun with? It was Leona. So this is just a card that just bails you out of so many situations and threatens late game. Zenith Blade plus Rune Prison is like the double checkmate scenarios. You can really cover a lot of people. Not to mention if you have things like, Facebreaker as a hidden card. There's just so many layers to this. A lot of people didn't play 3 copies of Zenith Blade because it was expensive with the double recycle runes. But that's why we played low curve, because there was turns where I even played double Zenith Blade. I actually did do that in one game, and the guy was not very happy, to say the least. And I won the game from that. That was against Akaisa. And that ended up being very game impactful to have double Zenith Blade. And I didn't mind it because, we're that low curve. We're trying to be aggressive. It's all about closing the game once we have that early lead. Sunlit Guardian is insurance. Sometimes you go second, and for going second and playing this on turn 1, it's actually a pretty chunky boy, assuming it lives. You get into a battlefield with Sunlit Guardian for whatever reason, and it ends up just being problematic. The shield is nice, especially if you give it buffed, it's 5, and then the tank ends up helping defend your Leona, which is really nice, and making the combat distribution math very difficult. So it's pretty solid. The thing about the Sunlit Guardian that I've come to find is going to be a preview of what I would change in this deck, is that it tends to die too easily to all the removal. So, the amount of times I play Sunlit Guardian and then the Hex Tech Ray it, and I don't want to Defy because it's not worth it. I need Defy for something else, for example. Or I don't even have Defy, end up being quite problematic. So there's been times where this card just kind of fell flat, and it is one of the cards that I would cut. but it ends up performing a lot better in matchups where it feels like it's less about spells and more about minions. For example, I did play against a Yasuo, and this card ended up doing pretty decently in the early mid game and gave him a lot of problems, so it was nice. Solari Shield Bearer is pretty much just Rune Prison on a stick without the action speed, and it's kind of nice to just play it to get an extra +1 buff as well. I've definitely done Shield Bearer on units that aren't even in battlefields. That's another thing. You can stun any unit, and that tempo is valuable, right? Because it's an extra body on board plus an extra 1 buff, and the extra buff helps things like Kingpin set, which is pretty valuable. So this card ends up being a very big engine for the deck, and sometimes just played for tempo, even if it's low value. Call to Glory. This is the best combat check in the deck. I actually haven't really been talking about it very much, but the fact that you can play it for 0 and consume a buff is huge. And you can consume any buff. It doesn't have to be a buff on a champion in the battlefield. You can spend a buff in your base. We talked about how Solari Shield Bearer stuns a unit to get that +1 buff. That also threatens Call to Glory. So, you stun a useless unit. You have Clockwork Keeper in your base with a +1 buff. Then you spend that buff with Call to Glory for a swing, and you left up 3 mana, so it's Zenith Blade and Call to Glory, and they're like, okay, I just have to play around Zenith Blade. And just keep setting up layers for your opponents to have to deal with. So Call to Glory is another big swing to stop your opponents from getting those key turns and finding definitive ways to get an advantage and stay ahead. Also, because this deck ends up not having a lot of cards, sometimes I just don't have anything to do but just play Call to Glory for 3. And that's also okay too, because then you're not losing any buffs on a unit for combat math. You can just play Call to Glory for +3 for 3. It's not really efficient mana wise, but that's also fine if that is the only thing you can do with your mana. So, I definitely casted Call to Glory for paying for 3 and also having impact. Set Kingpin is not a 4 trop that a lot of people play, but I just think it's kind of overstated. If you get a buff onto the Kingpin itself, the friendly buff unit counts himself. And so if Set has a buff, he goes from 5 to 6, and then because of his passive, he gets to 7. And you're saying a 4-mana 7/7? And he's also tank, which ends up being really good to protect some other units if you need him to protect Leona for whatever reason. And also partially why some hold strategies in the very late game. And again, those are very rare. You're not trying to hold very often the deck. But when you all in hold, Set Kingpin with tank can make some really nasty combat math, especially when you start adding in things like Call to Glory and all the different buffs and stuns. So Set Kingpin ends up being a very big stat stick that they just have to deal with. And then the last card here is 1 copy of Fiora Victorious, which and again, kind of a spoiler alert for the Sungular Guardian aspect things. I kind of wish I played a little bit more of, mainly because, well, there's a lot of Kaises and Annies. And when you're able to get a bunch of buffs, if you get a single buff on a Fiora, the deflecting, ganking, and shield is pretty hard to deal with. If you're ever in a situation where you can get Fiora and Leona onto the same battlefield, it is a nightmare for your opponents. But it's not that common because most decks are usually able to at least deal with one of them. Enemies don't want to let you buff Fiora, so they try to remove her. But if they use the removal and ways to deal with Fiora, that means it's green lights for Leona. And so that's like one dynamic to consider. The second is that she has deflect, right? And so they actually reduce their range in the future to get to those key turns like the Watchers or the Cathian Reigns or the key Aurora turns if they want to try to like manipulate things. And the best part is Fiora doesn't recycle a power. So she is very cheap to play on curve and you get to keep your momentum going. So I would definitely play more copies of Fiora in this deck list. For the sideboard, we're running 3 salvages, so that way we have gear destruction. Really crucial against Aurora decks, whether it's Mastery or Misfortune, and the matchups that I went up against them end up being really clutch. Hidden Blade is not only an answer for really big threats like the Aurora decks, but also Dr. Mundo and Teemo, which I thought was going to be a little bit more popular because of some of the discussions that I heard. And ends up just being your I win button against some of those really big threats. Also pretty solid against Vi as well, because they draw with more cards, but in the end, it's a way just to answer Vi. But you don't really need it to answer Vi. You have so many different ways to stop her. Windwall is if I sense that my opponent has over-indexed into giant spells. You're talking about like multiple copies of Cathian Rain. If I'm running into Time Warp and things like that sort, because I don't think Time Warp was making in a lot of ways to main decks, but some people still were running it. Also pretty nice against Ari as well if they are trying to go for, the Time Warp strategies. Vengeance is nice in case they were trying to play more base oriented. The nice thing about Vengeance compared to Hidden Blade is that you get to target them in their base. And then finally, Leona Zealot, which ended up being kind of an important card for my sideboard. I ended up playing this a lot in games 2 and 3 because they were just matchups that ended up being really nasty into. It's a really powerful catch-up mechanic as well. If you're playing against Annie and Kaisa, this ended up being one of the ways you can kind of swing back and have one of those break serve moments. So this card ended up being really good, and I think that this is probably going to go into the next section. But cards that I'd probably redo going into Houston, I'd probably make this my primary chosen champion because I think that Leona Zealot is really good in the meta that's dominated by Kaisa and Annie. This is probably the list that I would probably run if I were to do it all over again. Now that I know not just, of course, how the decks will be represented, but also how certain matchups go. The first thing is that I probably run Leona Zealot in my main deck. This is one of your primary tools to make big comebacks into the game. It combos extremely well with Zenith Blade. If you're able to stick onto the board and keep it safe with Azonia's Hourglass, it is huge. And it's one of the ways that I actually won a lot of games going second against some of the best decks in the game. I think I won multiple games going second against Kaisa in particular because when I looked for that one big turn to deny them to get onto the battlefield, I was able to keep up in points, and then I had to find one more turn to get back decisively on. Leona Zealot was one of the keys to do that. So I actually like running it, and as a result, because you're less consistent in getting Leona determined out, I would run more 4-drops to try and create a strong turn 2. And the best turn 2 against so many Kaisas and a lot of the Annies is Fiora Victorious to just give a lot of decks problems, and she doesn't recycle, which is really nice. So when you have Leona Zealot you're going to have to run a little bit more 4-drops. And the unit that we're going to be cutting is Sunlight Guardian. I end up feeling like Sunlight Guardian a lot of times was just a 3-mana 3 and not super valuable. And the dynamic around Leona was that people didn't want to attack into me anyways when I had a battlefield. So Sunlight Guardian ended up just not really getting a lot of shield value in a sense. Even though I got the battlefield, it almost felt just like 1 mana higher version of Poro. Like it's almost the same thing functionally, and it just died to removal. So a lot of times I actually was pretty disappointed by Sunlight Guardian. It is nice to go second and drop a Sunlight Guardian turn 1 though. So I will say that if you do want to run them in your side deck, maybe cut this Kingpin, maybe cut Leona, you can run a couple of them and play them on turn 1, and they are pretty solid, especially against a lot of the flurries of 2 might minions on the other side. I'd run more Facebreaker. I'm actually tempted to go 3, but because we're going Hidden Blade, it's just a little bit too much combat trickery and not enough substance. So I think a healthy split is 2-2-2 on the Hiddens, but you could justify going 3 on Facebreaker. I think this card is phenomenal. And because you're not playing Leona Determined as your champion, you want more consistent forms of stun as well. So adding more Facebreaker is probably not even bad. Hidden Blade ends up being really crucial for tempo because we're an aggressive deck, so we're trying to get onto the battlefield. Hidden Blade is both good as a hidden and also played from hand. But outside of that, pretty happy with the deck. Probably could tweak a couple more things. There's a couple of cards that I considered that I wasn't sure if I wanted to include. The first card was back-to-back because I thought that this was going to be one of my ways to react to Falling Star, but it's just so dead in a lot of other matchups. So didn't really find enough value off of this to actually play it, but could be a decent back pocket option if you need. You could also run Adaptatron if you even need to get more gear killing. If you are playing in a dominant, Aurora meta in your locals or skirmish or whatever, you can definitely run Adaptatron as well inside. The last card that I really wanted to think about in this deck, and I thought about it for a long time, was Shen. And I think that Shen is pretty underrated. I think he's a really good combat trick. The only problem with Shen was that you would have to leave up a lot of mana to have impact for Shen, and he's fighting for the Zenith Blade type of responses, and he didn't feel nearly as good. And a lot of times I end up leaving up mana with Shen, and then finding that I needed to defy and discipline more than I needed to Shen itself. But Shen has a lot of potential. So I think this is a card you could also think about, throwing into your sideboard, probably take out this extra Leona Zealot, although you could run 2. I've seen people do stuff like that and actually do okay. But yeah, I'd probably throw in maybe 1 or 2 of those cards just for your sideboard, depending on how you feel like combat's resolving. Because the most important thing with Leona is just make sure that you hold with whatever unit that you're trying to defend with. So let's go over a couple of mulligans just to give you an example of how I was thinking about certain matchups, starting with the first one that's the big baddie in the room, which is Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa, the battlefield that you're always going to be looking at the beginning, is usually either Reaver's Row, where they get to defend and move a friendly unit to base, or they're going to be playing things like the Dreaming Tree and giving you card draw. Honestly, I am very happy when I go up against Kai'Sas and I see card draw and not Reaver's Row, because Reaver's Row is really problematic for us. But Dreaming Tree allows us to have our card engine, which is really nice. It gives a lot of value to things like Discipline and On Guard. Our first battlefield is going to be Monastery, and let's just pretend we lost a die roll and we're going to be going second to start things off. Drawing our opening hand, looks like we have two Call of Glories and a Zonia's Hourglass. This is actually quite a solid hand. I am going to mulligan the Call of Glory number 1 because having 2 is a little bit excessive, and I'm going to mulligan the Solaris Shield Bearer. Zonia's Hourglass is going to be a really good turn 1 to defend, hopefully a 4-drop against Falling Star against Kai'Sa. And then, of course, if we get a buff, Call to Glory will help do some more combat stuff. So let's go ahead and mulligan and look at that. Turn 1, Zonia's Hourglass. Turn 2, Fiora. Get onto the battlefield. Hopefully find a way to defend her and get some stuns. And then when we get the stun and the buff, we can even use Hidden Blade to protect her. That seems like a reasonable starting hand. Go ahead and do a new hand here and try to play it for one more time. This hand is actually kind of godlike. I would probably just actually mulligan Rune Prison because you don't really need Rune Prison when you have Leona and you have Zonia's and Leona and Call to Glory. This looks pretty impressive. And On Guard to keep her alive. Turn 1, Zonia's Hourglass. Turn 2, Leona. And this is actually a hand that can play for first or second. I mulliganed into this hand for game number 3. Let's assume it's 1-1. And once again, we are going second. This is a tricky hand to play because it's very reactive and it assumes that you're ahead. This is a spot where I would actually get rid of Set and a Zenith Blade. I think Defy is going to be a key card in general to like stop a lot of momentum. We already have 1 set. It's going to be hard to play around 2 sets. And Zenith Blade, this is another thing about why I like 3 Zenith Blades, is that it doesn't feel bad to mulligan 1. Because yes, you can play multiple Zenith Blades, but 3 Zenith Blades is a little bit hard to actually get off. And we're not going to be using it till a lot later into the game. So I'm going to mulligan this, and I kind of whiffed going second, but hopefully I end up drawing a next card. Boom, turn 1, Solaris Shield Bearer. I'll play that on turn 1. And funny enough, by playing it, I'll probably stun a unit, buff itself to a 3. Next turn, aim to play Fiora or Set, draw another card, and play as normal. And so don't be afraid of just playing things for tempo. Even though a lot of time this deck really wants to synergize around the passive for Leona to get big stuns and stun like the enemies and get onto the battlefield and push them off and do all that crazy stuff with buffs on Fiora and Set. Just getting tempo onto the board is going to be really, really important. Let's go through all the deck lists of Houston to just talk about the certain matchups that you're going to be going up against. Let's start off with Annie, which is going to be more and more popular, if not already just as popular as Kai'Sa in a lot of the tournaments right now in Origins. Annie was the winning deck in this tournament, and man, I wish I played against more Annies. I felt really good about this matchup. There are some things that Annie can do to really give Leona a hard time, but the 2 key cards to shut down are, of course, the Vi and Ride the Wind combination. They have a big trash because they cycle through with Stack Deck, and they just punch a bunch of things through. They Scrap Heap, they Cycle, they Traveling Merchant, and they have Zon Warrens, and they look for Ride the Wind. Finding a way to stop Vi by turns 4 or 5 is really key. Things like Face Breaker single-handedly stops the Vi from doing the Ride the Wind, and you shut them down. Rune Prison, and that's where a Hidden Blade could be really key. The other thing to think about is stopping their big Darius turns as well. Darius is very hard to shut down if you don't have your combat tricks ready. So just make sure that Darius, especially because they're just going to invest a lot of turns. If they don't have Darius to win back battlefields, they're actually going to continue to get further and further behind. So shutting down both of these cards is of the utmost importance. Kai'Sa Survivor, surprisingly, is not as hard to deal with because she is only 4 attack. And because you tend to buff and you have things like shield, Leona is going to be effectively at 6 a lot of times because she buffs herself in shields. Set will be at 7. They are going to have to invest more into it with a cleave, for example. Remember, they're going to have to invest a lot in order to get you in a bad position, and then they go for a combo to end the game. You can stop all that. Couple cards to pay attention to. Gust is really nasty if they get a really good tempo swing on you. It could be very problematic for you, especially if they're able to gust and develop behind it. Some of them might be playing even more aggressive lists, right? And this actually is whether or not they're playing things like Noxus Hopeful in some of their other lists, or if they're just going to use things like Rebuke to actually push back unit as well. Those can be pretty nasty cards. But for the most part, I don't actually think that's that problematic of a matchup. And it's actually one of the reasons why I think Leona very secretly can do well in tournaments if you just get a lot of antes in your field. Mastery. Oh man, this matchup on the other hand felt a lot trickier, particularly if they were running Aurora decks. The first things first is that if you are not having gear destruction in your main against Aurora, you probably are going to get smashed if they draw the perfect curve. That's what happened to me twice. I did go up against a Yi and I went up against a Misfortune, and both of those Aurora games felt very helpless. But I will say that this is where maybe editing that deck list to play around Leona Zealot is really good, because not only is she helping you catch up against the Annies that are really fast on the board and the Kaisas, but she really shuts down things like, you know, these thick minions and idiots. This is one of those things where I was talking about Leona Zealot. She's actually really solid into Yi, because if she gives them -8 to a minimum of 1, that pretty much shuts down all of this. And yeah, it could be annoying if they play Deadly Predator and you play a deflect cost, but the swing from Leona Zealot is really huge. So if you sense a lot of Yis in your matchup pool for the tournament because you just know it locally, or you just think that Mastery or other Aurora decks are going to come into to play, having Leona Zealot is going to be really, really clutch. And maybe going back to what we were saying before, which is playing 2 by having 1 in your sideboard just in case. The nice thing about it is that for the most part, they move quite honestly. Like, I think one of the most satisfying things is when they do like Tasty Fey Folk and they play on the board and then they try to White Flame Protector, move it in, and they just get stunned and they get moved back because they can't do anything. Or they invest a lot into it, and this is where cards like Hidden Blade and other hard removal, I think Vengeance, I guess I definitely used that one time. Actually, it's funny because I was playing the side deck against Yi and I realized, or MF Aurora, and I realized I put all of these cards in. All 8 of my side deck went into to try and fight against this kind of deck. Be mindful of Zonia's Hourglass. That can definitely be something that messes with you a little bit as well. Try not to, you know, pull the trigger and then let them save it. Again, it's one of those things where you want to go for value on your side versus theirs. And I ended up tying the Mastery, and I think I should have won. I had a really complex board state, but even though they had the full works, they had Volibear out, multiple White Flame Protectors, multiple Deadly Protectors, multiple Fey Folk, I almost won because I had all the sets and Leona's and buffed Fiora out, and it was definitely pretty competitive. So this deck can go toe-to-toe if you need to play a game of attrition, but try not to let it get there. All right, Kaisa. Kaisa, we already talked about it, but basically Kaisa is going to be one of your bad matchups. That's largely because Falling Star answers so much, and if they don't have Falling Star, they have, you know, an amazing amount of pressure through leveraging Student and the buffs while drawing a bunch of cards. Darius, which is problematic. Watcher, which is problematic, and not only that, but it's also things like Watcher plus Falling Star, right? So to try to they could do Watcher onto multiple of your threats. They Watcher your Fiora and your Set and your Leona, and then they Falling Star everything. That's just like the Kaisa experience in a nutshell. The big thing that also makes it really difficult is that a lot of them have a Cathian Rain. I actually ran into a lot of Kaisas that had it in main and not sideboard, and a lot of Kaisas actually are putting it in sideboard because they don't want it for the mirror. So kind of unfortunate for me. So I actually end up going up against a Cathian Rain a lot. But going into, you know, some of the other games, they don't have it always, and you have to kind of play against Kaisa as if they only have like one of the answers. You can't play around everything. Is the big summary of it. You have to play as if you only are going to lose against, you know, one of the big threats. Because there's no way to play around Watcher and Falling Star. There's no way to play around a Cathian Rain. There's no way to play around if they have the time warp, or even their smoke screens, things like that. Just choose your poison based on what you think is the best possible range of options, and just kind of hope for the best. That ended up working out for me a lot. I played Kaisa in half my games, and I won 3 of them, I believe. I think I played against 4 Kaisas and won 3. But I do believe that one of them was because they just simply messed up. They did not know how to play around Leona at all, and so I got a really easy 2-0 win. But the people that did know how to play around Leona gave my life a huge headache. And there were very, very close games that came down to me doing some really nasty Zenith Blade stuff, or they were just not expecting certain cards. Like, I think some people got caught off by the one Facebreaker that I had at the time, or they didn't expect 3 Rune Prisons from hand, right? So that's like the way you get them. You try to play very aggressively and hope that you can hold. But this is a pretty bad matchup. Overall, I'll probably say it's like a 35-65 underdog right now. Misfortune Aurora is pretty much just the same as Mastery functionally, just teching a bunch of big idiots, play aggressive, and hope they don't get it. It's a little bit nastier as well because they can Mind Splitter and sabotage you, so it is going to get a lot more problematic. Another thing, too, to keep in mind is that possession is actually very nasty against you if they like possess things like your Leona and your really big, setups. So this matchup I actually think is also bad, but thankfully I ran into one and they dominated me game one. I barely squeezed out a game because they gassed out. I destroyed their Aurora in game two, and then game three they just whiffed. So I think I got lucky. But if I went up against more MF Auroras, this is also, I think, another bad matchup. Teemo, I think, is also a really bad matchup because they have the very, very unfortunate combination of Thousand Tailed Watcher and Gust. I definitely have gotten wrecked by 3 Gusts and a Thousand Tailed Watcher in back-to-back turns from one of my testing partners who played Teemo. So this combination is absolutely gross. And they have other ways to do it too. They have Stupefy. So they Stupefy one of your, they stupefy your Leona because your Leona is not defending. She doesn't have shield up. They stupefy and gust. So very hard matchup. Very, very hard matchup. I would say that this matchup is the only matchup that also felt just as bad as going up against Kaisa. So I was praying for no Teemos, and thankfully I didn't queue into any. But the one thing that you can hope for is, they're going to invest a lot into Mundo, and you can deny their Watcher turns. And I would say against this matchup, try to lean more on your smaller guys, like your Poro and Clockwork Keeper and your Shield Bearer. And this is actually a matchup where Sunlight Guardian ended up being very key because it's just enough, right? It's just enough to give them problems with Shield because, things like their Student, Ember Monk, and Sprite Mother are just going to give them a little bit short unless they like have the battlefield, and just try not to let them have it. So Teemo ended up being a matchup I didn't see very often at all, but I'm glad I didn't because that would have been a really hard one. The last of the popular matchups that we can go over a little bit more in depth is sets. I think this matchup ends up being quite good for us because they tend to, one, play battlefields that help you. Like Double Monastery is amazing for us. We just get to draw very, very often. Two, they tend to try and go big, right? They're trying to do a big set, whether it's Kingpin or Brawler, and give them big stats. And then if you stun them, then that's pretty much it. They can't do anything about it. The cards that you have to watch out for in this are obviously Showstopper. If they get to a battlefield, just always have an answer for it. Like, consider if they have a strong mid-range minion, can I deal with Showstopper on their turn? And if you have a stun, the answer is yes, because they will move to your battlefield. The other card to pay attention to is Challenge. This card can actually be one of the ways that sets get back into the game. So that is, they have a big buff on sets. You can challenge, and this is one of the main cards I use Defy for because Defy is really important to stop that. So just make sure that doesn't happen. Outside of that, though, you're playing a pretty similar vibe of just getting onto the battlefield, playing thicker idiots, and just trying to throw your body weight around, except you have stuns and they don't. That's pretty much the difference. So I actually really like this matchup. A couple of other small parting notes on matchups. I think Victor and Baited Hook Swarm decks are really problematic. I am also really glad I never went up against them, just because stunning individual units with Leona, like 1/1 recruits, is just not worth it. So I think whenever you're going up against some of these like Noxian drummers and machine evangel type of stuff, like these are just like really bad matchups. So you just have to basically be very aggressive and hope that they never get going. So just use your resources very aggressively and hope for the best. I did play against a Yasuo as my last round. This matchup actually didn't feel very hard either. It is kind of difficult to deal with Yasuo because Yasuo can still deal damage even if he's stunned. But I still feel like it kind of takes a while for them to get Yasuo set up, and you just get onto the board faster, and they never really get going with their board. So I actually felt really good into Yasuo. Thanks for watching my first video on Riftbound. I hope that you enjoyed it. I probably could have gotten more in depth on other categories or subjects. So if you want to give some feedback and comments saying, hey, this is the part that I really liked, I wish you did more of it, or hey, you yapped too long about this, probably cut back on section A and go more on section B. Or maybe you even have your own Leona tech. I don't think I'm the best Leona player in the world, but I definitely got a pretty decent result at the regional. So I hope that can inspire you to try more off meta stuff in Riftbound because I just think it's a really sweet game. And I'm really looking forward to trying my hand again in the next regional in Vegas. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you guys next time.